Welcome to the African History Notebook. I am your host, Dr. Clyde Winters. The African History Notebook tells the story of African history from the point of view of the researcher. In this case, yours truly, Dr. Clyde Winters. The African History thanks everyone for joining. This evening's topic will focus on the Asian Kushites. As you know, a lot has been written about the Kushites that lived in Africa, but basically what we know about these people is what we know about maybe the Meroitic Empire. In fact, many Eurocentric people, they attempt to imply that the majority of Kushites were maybe slaves of the Egyptians, or they fought the Egyptians, or whatever. What we're going to talk about today is those Kushites who migrated out of Africa into Asia. Many people don't know that there was not only a Kush in Africa and a Put in Africa, we also had in Asia a Kushia and a Puntia. The Afro-Greek writer Homer alluded to the two Kushite empires when he wrote, "A race divided, whom the sloping rays, the rising and the setting sun surveys." The Greek traveler historian Herodotus claims that he derived his information about two Kushite empires from the Egyptians. When we study ancient history, much of the ancient history is based upon what's called the ancient model. The ancient model of African history is based upon what we know from the classical writers and from the Bible. Many people may not take the Bible literally, but historians in the past, and maybe a few today, when they look at the Bible, they can see aspects of the history of black people. In chapter 10, line 16 of Genesis, we find mention of Cush, the son of Ham. And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Put, Ammon. And the sons of Cush, Sheba and Havilah and Sabta and Rama and Sabatikshah. And the sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erich and Akkad and Calneh, the land of Shinar. This passage from Genesis makes it clear that the Kushites were a very powerful people. It shows that the Kushites were situated in Mesopotamia and Anatolia in great numbers, in addition to the Sudan, where they were responsible for the sea group culture of Krima. Colonel Henry Rawlinson, one of the great explorers of the British, he was surprised in his research to discover that the founders of Mesopotamian civilization were of Kushite origin. I mean, African origin. He made it clear that the Semitic speakers of Akkad and the non-Semitic speakers of Sumer were both black or Negro people who called themselves Taga Gig Ga, or the black-headed people. This is very important in terms of understanding this aspect of part of ancient history. Rawlinson identified as Akkadians, but today, when you read in the history books, they talk about the Turanian people, or they talk about Pacific people. Although today they apply these terms Turanian to white groups or European or Indo-European groups, in reality, originally these terms were applied to the black people who formerly ruled much of Central Asia and Southwest Asia. There's both textual evidence and also archaeological evidence that support an African origin for the Kushites in Asia. When I talk about textual evidence, what I'm talking about is evidence that we have from various books. So textual evidence relates to evidence that's been written down. These Africans came to Asia from the Fertile African Crescent. I hope many of you were able to see my video on the Asian Kushites. If you did, you can follow us in terms of what we're talking about. The original Kushites lived in the Fertile African Crescent, which, as I discussed last week, was the highlands of Middle Africa. I call this civilization the Proto-Saharan civilization. And the reason I call it the Proto-Saharan civilization is that proto means early or ancient. Sahara would definitely deal with the Sahara Desert. And what I'm talking about is that period in history when the Sahara was bloomed, when the Sahara was a green savanna, a place where many and various ethnic groups lived. The first Kushite empire was called Kushites. This was part of an empire that was controlled by a people that the Egyptians called Tehenu. Kushite founded the first civilization on Earth. I know you probably read about the various artifacts from Kushite and how many people, archaeologists, were able to find out that the first writing came from the Kushite. Dr. Williams of the University of Chicago, he found that there was a direct progression of world complex designs from Kustal to Harankampolis and then Abydos. What he found is that in these tombs, he found many of the artifacts that relate to or what we characterize as Egyptian civilization. But one of the greatest civilizations of ancient Kush was the Sea Group civilization. When we're discussing many of the ancient people that lived in Kush, archaeologists have preferred not to give them a name, whereas we know that the people who lived along the Nile after the rise of the Kushites were called Egyptians. What archaeologists do is that they refer to some of the earlier peoples that may have contributed to the rise of Egypt as the A group, the B group, the C group. Well, the C group of people are people who we believe in a sense belong to a tribe that the Egyptians called the Temehus. The Temehus were organized into two groups, the Tehenu in the north and the Nahisi in the south. One of the things that you have to understand when you're trying to discuss African history is that many people over the years have been able to steal African history, and they've taken African history to be their own. I mean, you can see that every day when we find out that in the earlier days, maybe what we call country and western music, it was began by black people. But over time, the faces of the people singing this music changed, so we assume that African people made very little contribution to this. The same thing happened in relationship to various groups in Africa. So today, whenever you go to a textbook and you try to look up the Tehenu people, who were the Sea Group people, they usually, in a sense, show some bearded people who looked as though they're European or some Asiatics. The Sea Group people are best known for their red and black pottery. The Sea Group people, what they did is that they migrated from Africa, and they took this red and black pottery style into Iran, India, and all the way to China. And what we find is that this pottery created by the Sea Group people is found in all these areas. One of the reasons that we are called the Sea Group people, the Tehenu, is an art historian named Jelinek. What he said is that many of the people who formerly lived in the Fezzan in Libya, and the Fezzan was a very fertile area and it's still pretty nice to live in today, but he found, Jelinek, that the people dating between 3700 to 1300 BC were analogous to the Sea Group people. So we believe that the Sea Group people had to be a part of this early empire. We know that the Sea Group people are very important in the history of Africa because of the fact that after they left the Fezzan, they also, in a sense, began to build various empires in what we call Nubia. One of the first Sea Group empires is called the Wawat Empire. This Sea Group empire in Wawat, it began around 2300 BC. But we also realize that the Tehenu, one of the Tehenu civilizations left Africa and they moved into Asia. These are people who left Africa around sometime between 3000 and 2500 BC, were the ancestors of the people we call today the Dravidians. The Dravidians live in South India today. The Mandi-speaking people who live in West Africa and are spread all the way from the Niger Valley onto the west coast of Africa. Also members of these early Proto-Saharan groups were the Sumerians, who later appear in Mesopotamia, and especially the Elamites. The Elamites are a very interesting group, and we're going to discuss them a little more detail later. The Proto-Saharans claim descent from Ma, or the Fifth Confederation. The Ma Confederation includes the Egyptians, Elamites, Dravidians, Manding, and Sumerians. In honor of the great ancestor Ma, they worship a god called Amun, Ammon, or Amma. In honor of this great ancestor, the descendants of the Proto-Saharans use the term Ma to denote greatness, while other Proto-Saharans use the word to in their names. For example, the people that we find in West Africa, called the Mandi people, when we look at it, the word Mandi is made of two words, Ma, which means mother, Inde, children. So the Mandi people are the children of Ma. The Sumerians, they call themselves Ma-Gari. Ma, the exalted God, children. So in other words, we see that both the Sumerians and the Mandi specifically refer back to this god Ammon. When we think about Ammon and we think about Mal, or etc., these were gods in the sense related to fish, and that's one of the reasons why the Ma Empire was called the Fish Confederation. The people of Ma, the Proto-Saharans who formed the Kerma Empire, that formed ancient Wawet, they had their own writing system, and this writing system, archaeologists and other scholars call them Thinite. We're going to discuss the writing system in a later show, so tonight we'll just kind of gloss over it. We find in a sense that around 3500 BC, as the Sahara began to become more arid, many of the Proto-Saharans began to move out of Africa, out of the highlands of Africa, which had an abundance of streams. If you look at many of the ancient sites in Africa, you're going to find that on these sites there's a lot of engravings of boats. And that's because of the fact that African people, during the period of the Proto-Sahara, because of the fact that the climate was much more wetter, they had built numerous boats, and these boats, they were able to take these boats and sail throughout Africa, and many of them even took these boats and sailed outside of Africa. They took the red and black pottery, and they began to occupy the Anu sites in Mesopotamia. If you remember from last week, I talked about the Anu people, and the Anu people are the pygmy people of today, or the Twa people. They had a very fantastic civilization, but after the Great Flood, what happened is that they no longer had the capacity to sustain their civilization. So the Proto-Saharan people, Mandi speakers, Sumerians, Dravidians, and Elamites, they began to migrate out of Africa into Asia in search of new sources of minerals. A good way to look at this is you can think about the gold rush in America during the 1800s when they found a lot of gold and everybody went out west in search of gold. Well, this is kind of what happened around between 3500 and 2500 BC. Many Proto-Saharan people began to leave Africa and go to Asia and possibly America, but I can't really give evidence for America at that early period. But 2500 BC, 3000 BC, we began in a sense to see many of these Saharans occupy former sites in Asia where the Anu people had mined various minerals and gold. And what they did in a sense is they took this knowledge that they had developed in Africa while they belonged to the Kerma civilization, which lasted from 2450 to 20 BC, and the other sea group cultures, and they began to take this information with them to Mesopotamia and Anatolia. We find in a sense that Henry Rawlinson, he was one of the first scholars to really recognize this whole idea that the Mesopotamians, or the Sumerians, Elamites, Akkadians, etc., were black people. And what he did in a sense is that he used the book of Genesis. Yes, the book of Genesis was used by Rawlinson to be able to discover the names of the various people who later appeared in Mesopotamia. He did this by learning how to read the cuneiform writing, and he knew in a sense that Nimrod were represented by the family of Ham, the Kushites, Egyptians, and etc. This name came from the popularity among these people of hunting the leopard, the Nimri. And as noted by earlier people, is that Rawlinson, he knew that. So what Rawlinson wanted to do is he wanted to highlight the fact that this was a great civilization. And what we find is that when we go to Asia, and when you look at the maps, there's many place names that really help you to identify the earlier presence of African people there, especially Kushites. What I mean by that is that place names are long-lasting. And so when people move to a place, they usually give that location a new name, and it's this name that is sometimes retained by other people who may immigrate in. The Kushites, when they migrated from Middle Africa to Asia, continued to call themselves Kushites. This is most evident in place names and the names of gods. The Kassites, who ruled much of the central part of the Zagros Mountains, were called the Kashu, which is also the name of the people. And we find that when you go and look at many other places in Asia, they often have the letters K, S, H, which can either be translated as Kush, Kish, or Cash, to identify these places as places where the Kushites formerly lived. And I know many of you have probably heard about the Hindu Kush, which are mountains in India. What we find, though, is that controversy began to surround the ancient peoples of Sumeria. Although Colonel Rawlinson was ready to admit that the various, in a sense, Akkadians, Sumerians, and Elamites were black, many other people did not like that. And we find, in a sense, that although Rawlinson printed many good articles, and he did a decipherment of the cuneiform language, we find, in a sense, that most of the people followed a guy named Julius Oppert. Oppert was a German-born Jew. He lived in Germany, and what he did is that he made it clear that, okay, yes, the Akkadians spoke a Sumerian language, but no way was he going to admit that the Akkadians were black people. So what he did, in a sense, is that he began to teach that the Sumerians and the Akkadians were just another group of whites, and that these white people were, these Sumerians and Akkadians, were represented by the people who were presently living in those areas of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. This is very important to understand that many historians have what's called a positive attitude. And this positive attitude is an attitude that people who live in an area today have always lived in that area. This is not necessarily true. And that's why when you study place names, you can tell that it's not true. The Sumerian people referred to themselves as Magarab, or God's sacred children, but they were called by many different names by the Assyrians and other groups. The Assyrians called the Sumerians Ki-Engi people. They called, in a sense, this land that they lived in, Sumer-Ritu. Ki-Engi is very interesting because it means the sacred language. We find, in a sense, that the Sumerians developed a very beautiful civilization. But what they do is that when you try to study Sumerian history, like for years I taught world history in the elementary schools. And in fact, when I was writing the standards to teach history in the Chicago public schools, we went over much of the material relating to it. What you find is that when you study the Sumerians in the book, they rarely have pictures of real Sumerians. Instead, they have these people who are bald, very light or pale skin, and these people were not Sumerians. These people were called Gudians. And in fact, the Sumerians refused to even talk about the Gudians in any of their history. And although the Gudians took many Sumerian cities and ruled them for an extended period of time, none of these Gudians are mentioned as kings of ancient Samaria. It is strange to some observers that Opart never criticized Rawlinson, who had proposed that the kings of Sumerian people were black. He never opposed them. All he did was that he just made sure, in a sense, to be able to get people to recognize that, aha, these Sumerians, Akkadians, they were Semite people, and then people just naturally assumed that they were Semite people. They had to be representative of the Semite people that lived in Europe at the time and in Asia, such as the Arabs and other folks. Although Oprah successfully hid the recognition that the Akkadians and the Sumerians both refer to themselves as Sagiga, or the Blackheads. Very important to remember that not only did the Sumerians call themselves Sagiga, or Blackheads, we also know the Akkadians sometimes call themselves that too. And what was very prophetic was the fact that when Rawlinson began to decipher the cuneiform script, he went to a place called the Behistun. And the Behistun monument is a place where you see pictures of Circe, Cyrus, and others. And what's so important about this place is that they have these numerous pictures of black people. And these black people, the only difference between the black people who were in Mesopotamia and Anatolia and the black people who lived in Egypt is that in Egypt, for those of you who study Egyptian history, the Egyptians usually wore a fake beard. In Mesopotamia and Anatolia, on the other hand, the blacks there wore or had beards. They usually had curly or peppercorn hair, and they like to allow their hair to grow long, whereas people in Africa have usually like to have short hair. And I think one of the reasons that Africans like to have short hair is because of the fact that you have mosquitoes, flies, and things carry disease, whereas living in much of Asia, and it wasn't as hot, and so the black people there grew beards. And so we find, in a sense, that the only difference between these African people who lived in Africa, Egypt, etc., and the people or Kushites of Asia was the shape of their hair. And so what we find, though, is that Oprah began the myth that the Sumerian languages was an isolated language from other languages. When we talk about an isolated language, this is a way that they can say, aha, the Sumerians, they were great people, but they teach you when you go to school that the Sumerians had no relationship with, that their language is an unknown language. It's an isolated language, a language that no one can compare it to. This is a lie. It is false. We know that the Sumerian language is closely related to the Mandi language, which is spoken in West Africa today, and is also closely related to the Dravidian language. In fact, a friend of mine, Dr. Logampan of an Indian Dravidian, he's been able to show that many of the Sumerian ancient documents have complete correspondence. When I say correspondence, that means that many of the words in Sumerian stories and that the Tamil use are words that people, in a sense, are able to compare favorably, and they are entirely the same. Okay, so what we've done, in a sense, is we've been able to show that. Oprah began the myth that the Sumerian language was isolated from other languages so he could maintain this idea that the Sumerians and the Akkadians were the same as the Jewish people that live there today. It's also very interesting to remember that just as the Sumerians referred to themselves as Sagigal, the Blackheads, we also find that the Assyrians. And the Assyrians, they ruled much of Anatolia. They called themselves Salmat-Kakadi. Salmat-Kakadi. What Salmat-Kakadi means is black-headed people too. So they referred to themselves as blackheads. Many people, especially Europeans, they try to claim that why did the people of Kemet call themselves black? Why was you go to ancient China, they call themselves Li Min, which also means black people. They often say that how could these people recognize race And the thing is that there were foreign people in those areas, and I think they referred themselves as black because it related to their ancestry. And it's very important to understand that among the ancients, they looked at the world from the perspective of the checkerboard. When you see a checkerboard, in the past, the checkerboard was black, and it was white. So you moved these pawns and different various chess pieces across the board, and you moved them to black spaces, then the white spaces, and things like that. And one of the things they called it the checkerboard is because of the fact that to ancient black people, knowledge came from the great blackness. In fact, if you were really able to break down the word karma, in many ancient languages spoken by black people in Asia and Africa, kar means black. Ma, as I said earlier, means great. So karma means the great blackness. So often they refer to themselves as black, or they use this color black, because black implies to the Creator, a closeness to that being which they felt made them. So we find in a sense that the Sumerians and the Akkadians both lived in areas where they were able, in a sense, to build their own civilizations. Okay, we're almost coming up to break, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to cut to some commercials, and then after break we'll talk about the many of the black who lived in Anatolia. See you soon. Welcome back. The African History Notebook, again, is hosted by me, Clyde Winters, and I want to remind you that if you go to HTTP or go to the website omec98.net/historynotes3.htm, you can find information about the upcoming shows. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to spend a little time talking about the various groups, black groups that lived in Anatolia, and then I'm going to open up the line for questions. So if you have any questions about this show or last week's show, get them ready, and I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Okay, when you read about the Anatolians, you mainly hear about people that they call Hittites. Okay, and you're taught in school that Hittites were the first Indo-European speaking people, and you're taught that the Hittites were the original settlers of Anatolia. This is false. Anatolia was a great home for many Kushite people, and the major Kushite kingdoms in Anatolia were the Hattic and the Kaska. The Hattians, they created the basic civilization in Anatolia, and in fact, it appears that many of the people who we call Hittites got their language from the Hattic. The Hattic and the Kashkas, and another group called the Kushites. And the Kushites, although they put in the history books that the Kushites call themselves Kushites, really the Kushites call themselves Kashashu. So we find that Anatolia was a stronghold of many of the various Kushite people. During the 5th dynasty of Egypt, we find who these Hattic or Hattu people were. During the 5th dynasty of Egypt, 25 to 63 BC, during the reign of Safare, the Tehenu leaders referred to as Hati Tehenu. These Hatiyu, and when I say Hatiyu, what I'm saying is Hati, which means the people. You is the Egyptian plural suffix, so we'll say many people. So the Hatiyus, in a sense, were probably the people who formed the backbone of the various populations in Anatolia. There was also people called the Kashkas. Another very interesting group that came in addition to the Kushites, the Hattic, and the Kushites is the Elamites. And the Elamites, and I'm going to try to go over this kind of fast, but the Elamites are most interesting. And the Elamites are very interesting because we find that the ancient writers make clear that the Elamites were directly of descent from the various Kushites. The Elamite people, what they did is this, is that the Elamite people They were called in the various texts, they were called either Katam or Kashu. They call themselves Kashu. The Chinese refer to the Elamites as the Kushite. And the Kushite relates to the fact that, like the Kushites of Africa, many of the Elamites were known for their use of the bow. Moreover, in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, we read the bow of the lamb. So what we find, in a sense, is that the Elamites were a very important people. The Elamites, in a sense, also were called Scythians. And Esther calls Memnon's mother Cecilia. So we can see that Memnon, the great scholar, the great adventurer who fought at Troy, was, in a sense, part of this great empire. The interesting thing about the Elamites that I want to talk about is that the Elamites appear to have a direct relationship to the Mandi people. Let me explain. If you saw the old story back in the, they made a movie back in the day about Kunta Kinte, they talked about the fact that that Kinte was part of the Kunta clan. This is very interesting because several of the kings of Elam were named Kunta. So that shows they belong to the clan. In fact, I've done research on their language, and I find, in a sense, that Elamite and the Mandi language, especially Malinke Bambara, which is spoken by one of the two large groups in West Africa, have a direct relationship. We find, in a sense, that the most important period that relates to these Mandi speakers is during what's called the Sukauma period. The Sukauma period lasted between 1900 BC to 1500 BC. Much of what we know about the Elamites come from the Akkadian sources, but we find, in a sense, that during the Sukauma dynasty, there was a tripartite rule. And it's interesting when we think about the Sukauma dynasty, which was founded by the Mandi-speaking people, is that it was divided among a senior ruler who was called Sukauma, or the Grand Regent, and he was usually, in a sense, assisted by his brother, who was the co-ruler, and he also, in a sense, had the nephew. So again, we see this whole idea of Africans where you had descent from the mother. And by having descent from the mother, that means, in the sense, that often when you became a ruler, you really, in a sense, was the former king's nephew. We find, in a sense, that the Elamites or Persians were probably descendants of the Mandi people. This is obvious in the language and the names of the Elamite kings. For example, one of the Sukauma rulers was Ketur Nahunte, which would be Hunte. And he ruled Elam around circa 1752 BC. Another ruler that clearly has a Mandi name was Shutruk Nahunte. And Shutruk Nahunte, he ruled around 1160 BC. So as you can see, we find that there was a continuous period in which these Mandi people ruled. The Mandi people are very important in the history of Elam because what you find is that when the Dravidians, Sumerians left Africa, there was also many Mandi people. Again, what we talked about tonight is that the Kushite people, they came from Nubia. These Kushite people usually had boats. They navigated by using astronavigation. And astronavigation simply means that they were able to navigate their boats based upon the position of the stars and the planets. That they took these boats, in addition to moving overland, to Iran, or they walked across into Arabia, on into various parts of Mesopotamia, and they went from Iran into India, on up into China. These people, in a sense, let their presence be known by two things: writing, inscribed pots, and other documents. And they also spread this pottery style called red and black pottery. Okay, right now, I know I've talked about a lot, and let's see if there's any calls. Are there any callers on the line?
no, there's not.
Okay. Well, I'll go back to talking then. Okay, again, in a sense, if we go back to the Hattic people are very important, and again, in a sense, we know that when people talk about the Indo-Europeans, they like to always try to make it appear as though the Indo-European vocabulary, that their whole world, their whole civilization, can be documented back to the Hittites. But in a way, this is kind of very false. And one of the reasons that it's false is because of the fact that the Hittite civilization was basically a civilization that was founded by black people, the Hattic people in Anatolia, or the Kushites. Also, there's a lot of controversy surrounding a group of black people called the Hurrians. The Hurrians, they built a civilization that was called Hurrian and Mitanni. This Anatolian civilization has basically been considered to be an early European, Indo-European civilization. This also is false. We know this is false because when you look at the language of the people of Mitanni, who lived on the upper Euphrates, you can find in a sense that Sumerian language is closely related to the Dravidian languages that are spoken in South India, and also the Magi languages. Most of what we know about the Hurrian language comes from what's called the Tel El Armana letters. The Tel El Armana letters are some number of letters that archaeologists found in Egypt. And these letters were written to the Egyptian pharaoh. What makes these letters very important is that these letters were written in a diplomatic language, and this diplomatic language was not Egyptian, but Babylonian. Researchers who've done research into the Hurrian language have been able to determine that much of this language is related to the language spoken by the Dravidian people of South India. Okay, what happens is that we find that many of the Indo-European gods, and when I talk about Indo-Europeans, I'm talking about the people who live in, the so-called people who live in Western Europe and the people who live in Iran and India. When they talk about the European languages that belong to the Indo-European languages, they're talking about Western European languages. When they're talking about the Indo languages, they're talking about languages that are spoken in Persia or Iran, and languages spoken in India, or Indo-Aryan language. Okay, so what they found is that many researchers discovered that the Hurrian Mitanni's people had many of the words that later became synonymous with Indo-European culture. These words were basically words for the gods of some of the Indo-Europeans, and also horsemanship. And you know, Europeans like to promote the idea that they spread horsemanship around the world. In fact, they like to make it appear as though they were the first people to domesticate the horse. But a guy named George Calhoun, he's a guy over in the Netherlands. What he's been doing is that he did a study of the Hurrian Mitanni words, and he found that out of 500 Hurrian names, only 5 were Semitic. And this was startling because many people try to teach in the history books that the Hurrians were the first Indo-European people, but only 5 of the names are Indo-European, so you can tell that the Hurrians Mitanni were not, in a sense, of people that in a sense, are related to Indo-Europeans. What I found over the years is that the best way to research African history, ancient African history, is to learn languages. For example, back when I grew up on 47th Street, I was very lucky. And I was very lucky because, as I told you in the last show, I lived on Evans. And right around the corner from Evans, on 47th Evans, was Cottage Grove. They had a Moorish scientist temple. And this was fantastic for me because it was a guy named Hammurabi. What Hammurabi did is that he printed a newspaper, and this newspaper carried all different types of facts about ancient history. And also, I'd like to go around there and try to buy his newspaper, his historical newspaper. And I think he was copying off J. Rogers, because J. Rogers, he did a series of articles and various black publications in the 1930s that dealt with a lot of ancient history things. But again, by going around these brothers who were at the Moore Science Temple around on Cottage at that time, what made it so fantastic is that these brothers were speaking Arabic. And that fascinated me. And so what happened is that I picked up a lot of Arabic from hearing the brothers talking. I mean, he's a little kid, and I learned a lot from these brothers in terms of the Arabic language. I was lucky enough that when I went to high school, I studied French. And during my study of French, I became very, good in it at that time. I could read and write it. And I studied it from my freshman year up to my senior year, so when I got to university, I could really read the French documents. The documents in French that were translation of Arabic documents and ancient documents. And see, what happened is that by being able to learn these foreign languages, Arabic, French, I was able, in a sense, to really explore some of these historical things. And I think it's very important for those of you out there who are very interested in studying the ancient history of black people, is that you have to learn a foreign language. You have to learn a foreign language because often many of the best sources of ancient black history are not written in English. They're written in German or they're written in French, you see. And because they're written in German and French, that means that you're going to have to learn German or French to be able to have access. But what I had to do is that for me to be able to learn about the various black people in Asia, I had to not only learn, I learned a reading knowledge of German, but I also had to learn Dravidian languages, mainly Tamil, and at least a reading knowledge of that. I had to learn how to read Chinese. And so you have to, in a sense, learn these various languages if you're going to gain access to these documents. Because, see, when you know the language, when you know where the primary sources are, you can gain the information and be able, in a sense, to translate this information into knowledge. And see, that is what's most important in terms of trying to become a history researcher. Diop once said that you shouldn't dibble or dabble in research. You should try to do your best. And one of the best ways to do research is to learn a language. I know today the language of research is Egyptian. Back in the 70s when I was at university and after I graduated, the popular language was Kiswahili, or the Swahili language. So brothers learn Swahili today as Egyptian. But what I'm trying to tell you listeners out there is that if you really want to be able to make a great contribution to this ancient history, you have to be able, in a sense, to learn these foreign languages. Often, when I get in debates with people, they like to bring up this whole idea of genetics, and they like to believe that if you look at the Y chromosome, or if you look at mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, that you'll be able, in a sense, to really tell exactly who these ancient people were. Let me tell you something. Whenever you see a study that's dealing with Y chromosome haplogroups or mtDNA haplogroups, those studies have very little to deal with the ancient people. Those studies of DNA are studies of the DNA carried by the people who live in those areas today. And often the people who live in these areas today may not necessarily represent the people who lived there formerly. But you can, in a sense, be able to document some sort of relationship. Last summer, I published an article on the mtDNA of the Kushites. And what I was able to do is, I was able to show that by looking at what's called haplogroup, Y chromosome haplogroup R1, you're able, in a sense, to see a direct migration of these African people from Africa into Asia and the establishment of the various civilizations in Sumer, which was in Mesopotamia, and the other Hattic and other cultures in Anatolia. And it's very important to understand that you need, in a sense, a basic grounding in a foreign language to be able to go further. Are there any phone calls, or did you have any questions? Yeah,
there are no phone calls, but Dr. Winters, I'm interested in if you would talk just a bit and go back and talk about Anatolia, the Mitanni, the Hurrians. You know, I've written a book also, and I'm absolutely glad. My book is yet to be published, but I'm absolutely glad at the conclusions that you have reached in your work, because I came to the same conclusions with respect to the three of them. And there were certain characteristics about them that made, that raised eyebrows for me with respect to identifying these people as African people. And one of the things that sticks with me is that in my work, I point out the Nubians to have principally have been pastoral people, and Tehenu to have diffused the domesticated cattle, goats, and sheep around the ancient world. And when you talk about the areas of Asia Minor, particularly around the Black Sea area, you have, I've identified these populations as well, in Asia Minor and also. And another thing that sticks for me is the mythology from those areas tend to show the presence of African people. And so you mentioned the importance of learning the language, and I often argue with folks it's important to learn the mythology because the mythology is so full of indicators of the African presence. But I'm interested in you talking about those areas, if you would go back over it just a moment, because we, for the popular history that most black people know, you hear folks saying, we were in Europe, we were in, Southern Europe, China, and Mesoamerica, but few of us really understand directly across the Mediterranean from Kemet is Anatolia, or the land of the Hattic, and the African presence there.
Okay, well, one of the things that's very important to remember is that I think I brought up Amos Wilson last week, and Amos Wilson was a clinical psychologist and educational psychologist, and what he found is that history is important, and that when you talk about Anatolia, or you talk about black people in ancient Europe, the thing that confuses people is that they rarely see these artifacts, they rarely see these the iconography that depicts black people. There's I know my website, I've done some research on this. There's a guy, I don't know his real name, but his name on the internet is Mike. What he's done is that he's been able to go into the archives of the University of Borea Institute and other places, and he saw these dynamic pictures of how the Hurrians look, how, in a sense, the Medes look, you see? And when you look at these people, you can see their Africanness. But what happens is that many of us have been conditioned, and I'm glad to hear what you've been doing, because, see, what you've been doing, Farukanu, is that you've been able, in a sense, to get rid of some of that garbage, because whenever you look at these, instead of seeing black men or black women, what happens is that many people automatically have been conditioned to see what's called the typical Negro. And the typical Negro is that Negro who has very broad features, who in a sense looks draggart from maybe working on a plantation, what have you. And so that when you look at these black people and you see them with long hair, you see them wearing braids, you see them wearing that peppercorny short curls like many of your kids wear today, you look at them and you say, that can't be my people because they got a beard. But black people do grow beards. And see, the wonderful thing, and I hope that when you do your book, you'll tell us about it, because the thing is that Anatolia was also where we were. We were there, and so then although they want to teach in the book that the Hittites, what they did in a sense is that they really spoke what's called the Nishali language. The Nishali language was the language of the Hattics. And see, it was the Hattic people who really introduced civilization, who really created the first gods. And what we find is that much of what's called Hittite is really, in a sense, Nesashali. And what was is they pass on this stuff to you, and when you look at the book, they show a bunch of people. The Gudians were a mountain people, and the Gudian people, in a sense, they lived in the mountains in Mesopotamia. And many of these Gudians came down out of the mountains once they saw the Kushites move in and build Samaria or build a land, and they began to attack these centers, and they began to occupy them. And what happens is that you have to look at it from this perspective, is that when Indo-Europeans or when Gudians, and the Gudians are represented today by the Syrian people, the so-called Syrians, white Arabs, the Turks, they would in a sense be representative of the so-called Gudian people. And what they did is that when they took over these black lands, when they took over these black civilizations, they create so much art. They create so much art that it overwhelms, in a sense, the art of the people. So you begin to say, aha, here's an iconographic image. This image looks as though he's European, so it must have been Europeans who have founded this civilization. And that's not true. What it is that they make so much art that when you see the art, you naturally assume that this art relates to them and that they were the ones who created it. So you have to look at language, you have to look at place names, and I like the fact that you brought up this whole idea of mythology, because when I was growing up, we used to have the story about Billy Goat Gruff. And you remember Billy Goat Gruff was supposed to, you know, in that story they were trying to cross this bridge to get into this city of gold. There was an ogre who wouldn't let them in. Well, the ogre or ugri, that's a Hungarian word for blacks. And what happened is that these black people built so many fantastic cities in Europe that often they couldn't get in there unless they defeated the ogres. And so you're right. When you look at mythology, when you look at language, you can tell about the past. I hope that answered some of what you were talking about.
Thank you, it does.
And when is your book going to come out?
Sometime later this year.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you have closing announcements, we're actually for the last 3 minutes.
Okay, well, basically, I want to remind people that they can go to omec98.net/historynotes3